Well, this begins the first of 4 weeks of studying the book of Philippians. And we will take a reading out of each chapter. Philippians is 4 chapters long, and so each week we'll take a reading out of each succeeding chapter. So as we begin this whole series, I want to begin in a general way, and I want you to just imagine the Apostle Paul sitting down to write Philippians. It's kind of weird to think that at some point he sat down and he wasn't thinking, hey, I'm writing the Bible here, so I better be careful, right? He wasn't even thinking that he was going to write something that would become a book that would be read by literally billions of people. Instead, what Paul was doing was he was doing something that people have been doing for thousands of years as a way to connect with people who they were apart from. Paul is writing a letter, right? He's writing a letter, and what's more interesting is he probably wasn't actually writing it himself. Back in that day, you would have a scribe write on something like a kind of a thick piece of rough paper called parchment. And you would dictate to the scribe, and the scribe would write it down, and then the letter, and we know it's a Greek letter because it has that classic Greek structure to it. It's introduction, salutation, body, instruction, and then closing salutation. It's the one that you learned in English when you were a sophomore in high school but no longer use, right? So we know it's a letter, and we know that it was intended, as are pretty much every other ones of Paul's letters, that it was intended to be sent to a leader of the church, but then read to the church during a worship service, just as Arnold read a snippet of that letter to us here today. So one question is, why did Paul write this particular letter, or why did Paul write letters at all? And the answer is that Paul was a pastor. And not only was he a pastor, he was a special kind of pastor. He was what's known as an apostle. Now, the word apostle comes from the Greek word apostello, and it means sent one. And we hear in a couple of places in Paul's letter, that's how he understood himself to be. That's how he understood his call from God. He was an apostle to the Gentiles. The Gentiles are the non-Jewish people of the Roman Empire. And that was essentially Paul's career. For about 20 to 25 years, he would go around, and there were 3, possibly even 4, separate missions that he went on, where he would go from city to city, and he would start a church in that particular city. And once he got it up and running, he would go to the next city. He never stayed more than about 2 years in one place. That was the longest he stayed. Most of the time, he stayed far less time. As long as the church was up and going, he then could move on to the next one. But you can imagine, as a pastor with the heart of a pastor, he still was concerned about the churches that he would leave. And so the way that he would continue to pastor them is how? He would write a letter. Come on, people. Thank you. I heard you. Thank you. I'm throwing it out there. That's good. Thank you also for not saying he would send a text message. Because that's just not the... Okay, we'll just move on, okay? And so these letters would contain the information that he wanted to give them as a way of pastoring his people. The other interesting thing that needs to be stated about this particular letter, since we're going to be studying it for the next 4 weeks, is that it was written from jail. That is crucially important for us to know, to understand the words that Paul says. It was a letter that was written from a Roman jail. Now, back in the Roman Empire, like it is in so many places in the world today, places like Syria, places like Iran and Iraq, places like Sudan, places like China. It is a dangerous thing to be a faithful Christian. And that's the story that we hear of Paul in the book of Acts. He would go over and over again to these cities, and he would proclaim his faith, and he would get into trouble for doing it. He would be beaten. He was beaten on several occasions. One time he was stoned, and they thought that they killed him by throwing stones at him. He was thrown into prison several times. He was shipwrecked. The life insurance for apostles back then was really, really expensive. Even chapter 16 tells for us the story of Paul arriving in Philippi. And I encourage you to read that particular chapter. As we get into the book of Philippians, read Acts chapter 16, because it tells the story of the Apostle Paul going into the very first European city where a church formed, and that's Philippi, and going up to the very first European convert, a woman who was named Lydia. She was out worshiping God at the river. She couldn't go to a synagogue because in Philippi there weren't enough Jewish men to form a synagogue. You needed a minyan, 10 Jewish men, and then you could form a synagogue. There weren't that many Jewish men in Philippi, so Lydia was out there worshiping at the river. And Lydia was the first leader of the church, and do you remember what her occupation was? Wow, it's so silent in here. I'm just teasing you. You're probably thinking it because you have Lutheran sensibilities, you don't want to say it out in church. She was a merchant, and in particular, she was a dealer in purple cloth. Now, purple cloth was special back then because only members of Caesar's household, or let's say the royal family, could wear purple. And the closer you were to Caesar, the more purple you could wear. And so she hobnobbed with the rich and famous, this Lydia. But she was the one that got interested in the gospel, and so Paul taught her, and they gathered her household, and they gathered people, and they formed a church. But somewhere in the midst of that, as Paul was preaching, he was overheard by people in the city who were threatened by what he was saying, and so they pulled him into the middle of the city, and they beat him severely, and they threw him in jail. But it was a different jail that the Apostle Paul wrote his letter to the Philippians. They figure it was probably the jail in Rome or the jail in Ephesus based on what he says. He says in chapter 1, verse 7, as he's writing about how thankful he is in his salutation for the Philippians and for all their support of him, he says, "It is right for me to think this way about all of you because you hold me in your heart, for all of you share in God's grace with me, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel," the good news of Jesus Christ. And so Paul is writing these words from a jail. These warm, gracious, loving words. Rejoice, he says. And that's the word that we're going to hear over and over again each week. In some way, we're going to hear Paul be saying, rejoice, have joy. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. These words over and over, it's the letter of joy. And our question for the whole series is the question, how dare Paul say that? How dare he be so gracious, so warm, and so filled with joy? You see, he's in a Roman prison. And Roman jails, Roman prisons were designed to break a human spirit. They were designed to suck the life out of you. They were dark. There was no sewer system. Most prisoners often, or very many prisoners, were chained to the wall for months at a time, as Paul himself talks about in a couple of places. You couldn't rely on food. Food was something that you would get if you had friends who lived in the city. So many times people starved to death in there. They were horrible, dark places. And yet Paul somehow finds a way in the midst of this difficult time and place to know joy. How dare he? Well, the book of Philippians, or Paul's letter to the Philippians, is Paul's response to that question. And we will hear over and over again in each of the chapters Paul explaining how he can have joy in the midst of it, in the midst of difficult circumstances, how he can take joy, and how this joy can even cause him to respond by, as he teaches the Philippians, to live a life in a manner worthy of the gospel. That he can respond to the gift of joy that God gives him by living his life serving Christ. So we're going to look at that today, and as I get more specific and just talk about the words that we heard read from Arnold in this part of chapter 1, I want to look at this idea of how is it that Paul could take joy. And I think an encapsulation of that, of Paul explaining his faith, is wonderfully put right there in verse 21. It happens to be the first verse that Arnold read to us. And I'm going to read it again, and I want you just to take these words in, just to breathe them in, to think about them. Let them just kick around in your heart somewhere. This is the verse. For to me, living is Christ, and dying is gain. For to me, living is Christ, and dying is gain. Now here's something that we know about Paul. He was in touch. He knew his culture. He was an educated human being. And in fact, in many of his letters, we hear phrases that he borrows from different philosophy systems. And that verse itself was probably borrowed from a school of philosophy at the time. And that school of philosophy was a group of philosophers that were very popular. They were called the Cynics. It's where we get the word cynical. And what cynics believed, and this is why this is how you know the definition of cynical. What cynics believed is that life was pointless. That in fact, they said life is a vale of tears. And even though in the midst of it you get glimpses of happiness, what you're really doing is you're going from struggle to struggle. And so they said life is a vale of tears and death is gain. Not because there was anything after death,